Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I think it might, just to wake people up, be good to start with a bit of audience participation. And I'm always keen to know of the threats in the room. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to know if we've got any killers in the house. So please, could you put your hand up if you'd killed someone you'd only just met, who posed you no threat and had done you no harm? No, there was a chap here that was sort of, could be, if he looked at me funny. Can you skip the slide forward? So, 2/3 of you are lying, which might be a shock to you. And if you're confident that you're not a killer, maybe look at the two people to the left and the right of you and look at them in a different light. I'd like to take you back, if I may, to the early 1960s, and trip over the wire. You're this lovely chap here in the white trousers with the fetching blazer. I think you've borrowed it off your friend who's a flight attendant, and you've turned up to to volunteer for an experiment run by a guy called Stanley Milgram. As you turn up, you meet the chap in the middle, who is obviously a scientist. You can tell he's a scientist because he's got a badge on and a white coat. And you also meet this other chap who's completely above suspicion because he's got a bowler hat on. But the joke's on you. Unbeknownst to you, the scientist and the chap in the bowler hat are both actors. And you are told that you are going to take part in an experiment on learning and the effect of different approaches to learning and their effectiveness. And you appear to be randomly allocated a role, but it's all a fix. And you're going to be asking the questions, and the other chap, the chap in the bowler hat, is going to be the learner. And he's taken into a room and strapped into an electric chair. This is how things roll in the early 60s before they had ethics boards at universities. You might be a bit worried about that. A bit surprised, but you go to another room next door and you're shown the equipment, and you're told that you've got to ask the other chap in the other room a series of questions, and every time he gets a question wrong, you've got to give him an electric shock and increase the voltage. So it starts off fairly tame, and you start administering shocks to people, and you keep turning up the voltage. And under those conditions, 2/3 of people will go on to administer an electric shock that's fatal. 2/3 of us in that situation will kill someone. So what's going on there? Well, none of you put your hand up and said you were a killer. I've got my eye on you, but you maybe if you'd had a bad day, you'd do it. But none of you thought you were a killer, and none of you were surprised that the people next to you weren't also killers. Because we're all good people, right? We all think of ourselves as good people. It's an example of a principle of social psychology, which is the concept of the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error is the idea that we all are biased towards seeing the world as people acting on the environment. And consequently, we tend to miss the influence of the situation or the social context on people's behavior. What's this got anything to do with company culture? Well, before I get into that, I think it's worth just being really clear on what we mean by company culture. And I think it's important to say there's no right answer to this, and nor is there ever going to be. People are going to continue to argue and disagree about what culture is for the rest of the time. But at the Pioneers, this is the model that we follow. It comes from a guy called Ed Gusheen, and it defines culture as the accumulated shared learning of a group as it solves its problems of external adaptation and internal integration, which has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, feel, and behave in relation to those problems. This accumulated learning is a pattern of systems of beliefs, values, and behavioral norms that come to be taken for granted as the basic assumptions and eventually drop out of awareness. Well, let's turn that into English. So this is what we think of as culture at the Pioneers. It's basically a set of standards. It's a set of standards that establish what people have to notice, what they have to think, what they have to feel, and what they have to do in order to belong to and be accepted by the group. And those standards are created as your team grows from an initial startup and works out, how do we need to work together effectively? And how do we need to satisfy the needs of our customers and our investors? And how do we need to attract a talent into the organization? So, why does it really matter? Well, imagine for a minute that you run a restaurant business and you've just employed Holly. Holly is a new waitress. And I'm curious to know whether Holly's going to clean tables, right? There's a dirty table in your restaurant. And I'm curious, is Holly going to stop and clean the table? Now, I think we can all accept that what Holly's not going to do is refer to your corporate strategy or your brand standards, right? She's not going to go around going, what's the corporate strategy on cleaning tables? It's definitely to do it. No, what's going to happen is you probably expect you'd be able to predict Holly's behavior based on the things you know about her. Like, is she hardworking? Is she conscientious? But you've just discovered you're a killer. So don't fall prey to the fundamental attribution error. Now, in our opinion, the biggest influence on Holly's behavior is, do the other people in your team clean tables? Because if you join a business where the culture is that people clean tables, then if Holly's lazy and doesn't clean the table, someone's going to take her aside from the team and say, Holly, you need to get onto that table. And if Holly doesn't pick up on the subtlety of that cue, then the subtlety of it will decline. And the group as a whole will try and exert pressure on Holly to get with the program, to fit in and to do the things that we do within this group. Equally, if Holly is really hardworking, she is really conscientious, she cleans all those tables, but the culture of the group is that we ignore them, then after a while, someone will take Holly to a side and say, look, Holly, you don't need to bother with that. You're making us look bad. Just slow down a bit, or this is more important. And over time, those cultural norms start to influence how people behave. And in the context of a growing business, in my view, it's culture that gets work out the door. Does that make sense? The way you do things is that your cultural norms are what's going to influence people's day-to-day decision-making, their behavior, and how you deliver what you're trying to do for customers. If you're not already convinced by the pervasiveness of culture on people's behavior, this might add something to it. There's a social neuroscientist from the States called Matthew Lieberman, and he's written a really interesting book looking at how our brains work. And his view, if I was to paraphrase, is that the thing that makes us peculiarly human is our ability to collaborate on a scale that no other animal manages. When you get large group collaboration in nature, like bees or ants, it tends to be because they're all actually part of the same family. They all have the same parent. Humans are the only animal that can collaborate on a scale with people who aren't their kin. And Lieberman's research has identified what he thinks are 3 really interesting brain adaptations that make us peculiarly social. So the first is that when you put someone in a brain scanner and you get them to experience like social pleasures or pain, what happens is that they use the same architecture in their brain to process that information as they would for physical pleasure or pain. So it's why a breakup of a relationship feels like like you've broken your leg. As far as your brain is concerned, you're processing that information in pretty much the same way. So we all got this cue towards social pleasures and pains. They make us feel good or they make us feel bad, and that obviously influences our behavior. The second thing is what he calls mentalizing. So there's something called the default neural network, which Matt does psychology with plasticine, is basically what your brain does on standby. So if between things, your brain goes into a consistent pattern. And what they've worked out is that when you are doing that, you are mentalizing, which is you tend to be thinking about what other people are thinking, or more often, what other people are thinking of you. Does that make sense? And we all tend to be preoccupied by how do other people see me? What's going on in their heads? What will they do next? What are their intentions? And trying to read that. And indeed, we read that into inanimate objects. That's why we give animals characters and that sort of thing. We have this way of creating a sense of agency and protagonist in the minds of other people. And the last thing is what he calls harmonizing, which is this idea that we understand ourselves as we are reflected back by others. So if you put a teenager in a brain scan, you ask them, Billy, are you good at violin? The question that Billy actually answers is, do other people think I'm good at playing the violin? And Lieberman's view is, and I can tell you this is 100% true as a parent, what happens is you develop a sense of yourself as you are reflected back by others, and in particular, how your parents want you to see yourself. So I am constantly trying to recognize all the things in my daughters that make them slightly easier to handle. Right? So every time they're nice to each other, boy, do I dive in on the praise of being nice to each other, Every time they get up and don't cry after scuffing their knee, how brave they are. And by the time they reach adulthood, they've developed this sense of themselves, which is actually, in large part, how me and my wife want them to see themselves. But because they think they're different and special, their behavior is then much more consistent with that model into adulthood. So we're all social animals. We all are incredibly well adapted to behavior to being part of a group. And culture, if you like, is the rules of the game for that group. It's the way we do things around here. It's the norms that say, do you fit in or do you not fit in? In the context of growing organizations, I think people can fall into some fairly simple traps. The first is they start to see culture in a really causal way, right? However powerful your company culture, it is not going to determine people's behavior. There are a myriad of other influences on people's behavior, like personality types, situations, like if you turn up on a bad day, your girlfriend's just dumped you, then you behave differently than if you turn up when something lovely's just happened to you. So there are a huge number of factors, and there's not a simple causal relationship between your culture and how people behave. Similarly, you can't determine your culture. Sometimes I think you get this particularly with business leaders who've grown up in a particularly analytical environment. They start to try and treat their culture a bit like their strategy or their budget. Yeah, they want to control it. They want to fix it. I think one of the things that for me that stood out in all the contributions this morning is that where you have a healthy culture, it's distributed. It sits in everyone in your organization. And consequently, you're not going to be able to affect that directly. I think if you want a metaphor for me, you need to be a bit like a gardener. You can choose how you try to design your garden. You can choose what you plant. You can choose how you water it and when you put fertilizer down. And you can pull up some weeds. But what you can't do is actually determine how the plants are going to grow. So what are the influences on let's start with a startup. What's the influences on a startup culture? I think the first thing, the most obvious one is the personality, the values, and the behavior of the founders. Like startups tend to be quite like families, and founders tend to imbue their values and their assumptions into that startup in a similar sort of way. And again, that stood out for me this morning in some of the, where you have a founder who cares passionately about culture, you get the sense of an organization that's going to stay true to that essence as they grow. The other thing that influences culture is just stuff happens, like events. One of our clients is Honest Burgers. And I should recommend the Christmas special burger, by the way. That's a top tip. But the Honest Burgers, one of their values is simplicity. Now, that doesn't come from Tom or Phil, who are the founders. They didn't decide they wanted to set out to create a simple business. What happened was the first restaurant they got was in Brixton Market, and it was literally the same size as this stage. And they had a grill. The kitchen was in this space, so they couldn't do coffee and they couldn't do dessert because there was no space for it. And because the business boomed and really took off, they came to the view that they didn't need to do those things and they could afford to keep it really simple. But it wasn't that predestined. They didn't try and design it that way. Just stuff happened. And in the context of every organization where you're trying stuff, things that appear to work, you'll stick with. And the more it appears to work, the more embedded it becomes in your culture. The other influence is what's called a metaculture. So you talked about different nationalities having different metacultures. How awkward it is for us to be so positive and demanded. But and the difference in the French and the English metaculture in terms of work is really profound and huge. You also get metacultures that stretch across industries or professions. Engineers approach a problem in a certain way, designers approach it in a different way, and organizations, particularly when they're growing, it doesn't make sense really to question much of what the influence is from the metaculture. Or you might deliberately choose to buy into one. Like, if you buy into the lean startup methodology, it's a metaculture. It gives you a way of working that you don't have to think through for yourself all the time. So why does growth necessitate culture change? Well, look, there's a really common sense answer to this, which is you can't run an organization of 1,000 people in the same way as running an organization of 10. You can't have emails going to everyone when there's 1,000 people. And it's not that it was the wrong thing to do when you were 10. It's just, it's no longer, it kills your organization when you grow to any size. Similarly, though, the process and structure you need to get 1,000 people to work effectively will kill a startup. So there's a process of, as you're growing, you're constantly needing to iterate and reevaluate your culture. And I personally think Reid Hoffman's got what he calls the people stages of growth, which I think these are not like hard and fast numbers, if that makes sense. But his view is that there are transition points or inflection points where you have to radically rethink, redesign, and re-engineer your culture. And that if you continue with the thing that made you successful at the previous phase, it'll actually start to compromise your success as you move forward. So he talks about the family, like this, that group of less than 10. Then a tribe as you move up to towards 100. And then when you pass through the sort of hundreds of people, you become a village, then a city, and then a nation. I'd just like to focus on these two bits for a second, because I think this is in most organizations, this is the really interesting cultural transition where you change from a culture that's primarily about survival, frankly, like, just getting this thing off the ground, to a culture that's about how do we grow this. In that context, I think Dunbar's numbers is a really... Has anyone come across Dunbar's number? No, I'm inordinately jealous of this man because he's got his own number, which is a personal aspiration of mine. I haven't decided which number I'm going for. But if I could get a number before I die, I'd be really pleased. Robin Dunbar's an anthropologist, and he was curious about why do monkeys and apes spend so much time grooming, like picking nits off each other? Because it doesn't appear to have any correlation to mating activity, nor is there any nutritional benefit. So, why hasn't evolution driven this out? I'm sure it's a problem that's troubled all of you. So you'll be relieved to get the answer in a minute. And what he did is he looked at the behavior of grooming activity in different species. And what he noticed is that it's literally a case of, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So, and it's particularly female pairs. So female pairs will spend time grooming each other. And then if the alpha male in the group comes across and picks on one of that pair, then the other one that's just spent 2 hours picking fleas off, they'll stand up for them. And by forming those reciprocal bonds, they manage to moderate the behavior of the other members of the group. And what's really interesting in the research is that he found a correlation between the amount of time that a particular species will spend grooming, the overall group size within that species, and the complexity of the brain. And the more time you spend grooming, the stronger the reciprocal bonds, which means you can have bigger group sizes, but you also need more brain complexity to stay on top of who's in with who. So that I know I can't pick on you because you've got a relationship with that ape over there and they'll come to your defense. And Dunbar's number as it applies to humans is about, which is the best bit about a number, I'd love an about number, about 100 to 150, which is the group size, in theory, that we should be able to maintain within human groupings and keep it cohesive without reference to external authority and rules. And actually, when you look at prehistoric human groupings, like tribes and villages, if you look at army units, those sorts of things, they all tend to top out at about that size. So if you think back to, now we're running through things. If you think back to those influences on the culture, as you're growing, the fourth one becomes really important, which is what we call the people operating system. Or if you think like the structure, the systems, the things that you need to introduce to manage a group that's too socially complex. And again, I'll reference those numbers in terms of stretching through 100 are like a rule of thumb. The more complexity you have in your organization, like the more locations you work in, the more product lines you have, all that, those numbers start to creep forward because people can't stay on top of stuff. So there comes a point where critically, as a founder, you can no longer run your business just on personal influence. And unless you've got a system for managing your people, unless you've got something that can pick up that slack, your company will top out. And we're working with an organization at the moment, has an amazing founder, just the sort of person you'd love to go and work for. But everything goes through them. They are the keystone for everything that happens within their organization. And as amazing as you can be as an individual, you've only got so much capacity. And we're trying to help them to build out a system within their organization so that person no bit longer becomes the block on progress and the block on growth. So what do we mean by a people operating system? Well, it's a really inelegant definition. It's like management stuff, right? It's like the processes, it's the policies, it's the systems you have in place. It's how the actual management practices themselves, like how you run meetings. It's all those sorts of things. It basically is one cut off the bottom of this slide, unfortunately. But how work gets done, who does it, when they do it, where they do it, and critically why they do it. And if you're interested in trying to build this out, what are you aiming for? Well, in my opinion, a great culture is one where you get this sense of flow. So another chap, psychologist called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, has this view of what humans are like at their best is what he describes as a state of flow, or like being in the zone. So, if you've got a hobby or you play sport, you play an instrument, like something like that, you may have had an experience where time either moves much more slowly or much more quickly than it usually does, and you just get lost in something. Who's had that experience? Fantastic. Good. That's when you're in flow. And the reason you have that experience is because your strengths are being very, very slightly stretched by the challenge you face. If the challenge was too easy, you'd get bored and your mind would wander. If the challenge is too hard, you get stressed and you start to get overly self-conscious. And flow is that little channel where you can focus on the task and it absorbs you without stressing you out. And Csikszentmihalyi's view is that is an indication of people working at their best. And from a cultural perspective, what does that feel like? Well, it feels coherent, like the organization isn't working against itself. Like organizations with great cultures are ones where you don't experience that tension of like, we're saying this, but we're doing this. Or we're doing this over here, but over here's an absolute mess. It feels coherent. People feel present and focused and concentrate. You get that feeling of being in command, like you're really doing great stuff. And you're really being, without sounding twee, you're like the best version of yourself. And it's intrinsically rewarding. Like people love flow activities. It's why we seek out hobbies. It's why we try and do these sorts of things. And the highlighting should be on the bottom one, which says the team is more than the sum of its parts. That's a great culture, is when you know that you can put an individual into that environment and it will deliver more than what they can bring on their own. So before I share like how we go about that, how we try and create operating systems that create a sense of flow, here's three little things on how not to do it. The first one is don't turn your culture into a relic. See this all the time. Read all that advice on LinkedIn, which is, protect your culture. Now, there are aspects of your culture that you will want to protect as you grow. But the truth is, the more you want to grow and the faster you want to grow, you will need to be evolving more than you keep the same. And in my opinion, organizations that overly focus on protecting their culture are the ones where culture retreats from the day-to-day of the business. And it becomes a conversation that people have just at away days. And it doesn't show up at all during the week. And if you allow that to play out for too long, you just get this dissonance. People can see the difference between the rhetoric of what we say we want to be and what we're actually doing. And it kills your company. I know there's some terrible things going on in the world right now. This is up there, right? I don't know if anyone else has seen this, but it's the people who put the Apple stickers on their Lenovo ThinkPads, right? And it's not. The people I see are the middle-aged men on trains who do this. And my great fear in life is maybe 10 years from now, I'll pretend I'm younger than I actually am, maybe 10 years from now, I'm going to have a crisis, and I'm going to come home to my wife, and I'm like, honey, look, I think I'm going to buy a Harley Davidson. I think I'm going to go to Vegas. I need to rebel. And my wife, who you'll have gathered from this contribution is actually the brains of the family, will say, yeah, you could do that, love. Yeah, you could. Yeah, that would be edgy. Or, thought for you, have you thought about putting that sticker from your iPhone on your laptop? That's pretty cool. This happens all the time in the culture space. People get inspired by stuff they see work at Netflix and Zappos and all these companies that we've heard have done great things with their culture, and they try and cut and paste it. And you can't cut and paste culture. If you think back to that definition we shared before, culture's shared learning. It's fine to be inspired by the example of others, and I'm all for that. But you need to work out a way of making that make sense for you and making it fit within your culture. What you can't do, and I'm afraid we have these conversations with larger organizations all the time, where they say things like, oh, we want to be a bit like Google, or we want to be a bit like this. It's like, you can't shortcut it. You have to learn it from yourself. You can't stick the bloody Apple sticker on your rubbishy laptop and have an Apple MacBook. And then the other thing is you can't keep bolting on stuff, right? I don't know if you get this phenomenon in the States. Do you have like boy racers? Yeah? My youth was like, see, these people were around all the time. It's a rubbish car. It doesn't matter what you stick on it, it's still a rubbish car. What happens in the culture space, and it's a real risk as you grow and you get people in with depth of experience and expertise, is you build out your culture in silos. You build out all the components. Yeah, you go. You're doing the equivalent of we could stick a spoiler on this, and we could put some alloy wheels on it and drop the suspension and all that sort of thing. You just create a really rubbish car. You need to have one eye on the system as a whole, not just the components of your operating system, but how does it all net together as one? And that's the real trick, I think, if you want to create a special culture. So how do you do it? Well, this is how we look at people operating systems. And I'll just talk you through this briefly, if I may. So broadly speaking, you need to do three things to manage your people. You need to engage them, so that middle column. You need to get them working for the benefit of your business. On the left, you need to execute. You need to get your people to translate your strategy, your brand, your vision into some form of product or customer experience. And almost all businesses are also looking at how do we use our people to explore the next wave of growth at the same time. And one of my clients described this as a bit like a board game. So you start in the middle. You start with a line and influence. And it starts really with a story. You can't have a great culture, I don't think, unless you have a clear narrative, whether you've chosen to articulate it or not, that says, this is who we are, this is why we exist, this is where we are now, this is the challenges and the problems we're trying to fix, and this is where we want to get to. And this is what we need to do as an organization and how we need to behave in order to get there. And once you have that narrative, do people get it? Do people understand it? And perhaps even more important than the rational perspective of do they understand what you're trying to do they care? Because if they don't, nothing's going to happen. Once you've got that story, it's about does it echo in your employee experience? So if we're saying we've got these values, do they resonate in how we recruit people, how we onboard people? Does it resonate in the office space? Like, can you see them? Does it resonate in the tools we give people to use? All those aspects of the employee experience. And equally, how have we structured and networked? How does the information flow around our organization? How do we get work done? And then from there is how you chunk that big story up into the objective. Like, how do teams understand what they need to be working on? How do you make decisions? How do you get people to coordinate and collaborate work, and how does that work get reviewed or signed off? So like an iterative cycle on that side that's mirrored on the far side. How do you as an organization identify new opportunities? How do people experiment? Does everyone have the right to run an experiment? Do a few people have a right to experiment? How does that work? And then how do you capture and share the learning from those things? I think this is most useful in a few ways. Firstly, it's a useful tool for helping to bring some of the assumptions that sit at the heart of your culture to the surface. And as you're growing, if you're looking to challenge, particularly if you're looking to be disruptive in your industry, you need to make some quite deliberate choices about whether you follow how everyone else works or whether you're looking to do your own thing. So we have a number of restaurant brands that are growing. Every restaurant in the world that grows to about 10 sites will employ an area manager, because that's what you do. It's just how everyone runs a restaurant business. No one really questions, is that the right model for our business? And a tool like this, I think, helps you to surface some of the assumptions that sit behind the business you're building. Simple things like, when the working day starts, does everyone need to be in the same office? You know, those sorts of things can get baked into your organization unintentionally. The second thing is you can start to see the sources of tension, the bits about where your operating system is pulling against itself, and if you want to grow, what are the constraints on that? And then finally, where you need to introduce new things, where you want to be inspired by something and test it. And then as you introduce those things, what are the transitions? Like, how does that affect the other parts of the system? So I could prattle on for ages about that, but I won't. I think, if I may, I'll just leave you with a few key principles if you're interested in creating a culture for growth. The first, as I said, is you need to be able to see the wood and the trees. Does that make sense? You need to see the detail in your recruitment process or how you set up a meeting and understand that that also has an implication on your wider culture. And as you change your wider culture, you need to thread it back through to those individual touch points. The second thing is you need to be brave. Like, you're going to spend most of your life at work or asleep, but mostly at work. And for most people all across the world, work's at best pretty mediocre. And my personal thing is why I do the work we do is, like, I think you've got 60, 70 years of useful life, and then they're going to stick you in a box. And you're going to spend all that time at work. So why would we want it to be a mediocre experience? And at the heart of everyone who creates an amazing culture with an organization is the bravery to be different and try stuff, and a determination just not to settle for average. And there's also, I think, another bit of being brave, which is the ability to keep burning your boats. If you really want to grow your organization, you have to be prepared to leave stuff behind, and you have to be prepared to cut off people's ability to retreat to stuff. Does that make sense? Those conversations you get in, difficult conversations you get in organizations where people start talking about, we've lost this. We're no longer like as true to ourselves, or it was better when we were 20 people. You've got to listen to those objections, but if you want to grow, you can't allow yourself to retreat back to the safety and the familiarity of what you used to be. When you make a decision as an organization to move forward and to change your culture, you've got to go for it. You've got to have leaders within the organization who are prepared to commit to that and not going to try and keep pulling you back. And then the last one is if anything that stood out this morning from all the other contributions and you learn by doing. Culture, I think there's been some interesting conversations today about values and culture. And for me, culture is a practical skill. It's practical wisdom. So imagine we're getting you to make a a pot. Or let's do a mug. Slightly easier to run. So we can spend 6 months listing out on a blackboard what a mug is. So it's basically cylindrical. It's got to hold liquid. It's going to have a handle. Yeah, and we can talk about that to death. But the value is in actually making a mug. It's sitting next to a potter's wheel and taking a lump of mud and crafting it into a mug. Now, yeah, you do need to know what you're shooting at. And value statements are important in saying this is where we want to aim for. But the real value of it is in, can you make the bloody mug? Yeah, and that's a practical skill. And it relies on the storytelling within your organization. It relies on people having the ability to bring it to life, to facilitate great conversations, to facilitate great meetings. It's the practical skills. And as a balance, yes, of course, values are at the heart of a great culture, but companies with a great culture are the ones who got the practical skill to turn that into something. That was my piece. Thank you.